A Series of Unfortunate Events. The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. Chapter 2. It is useless for me to describe to you how terrible Violet, Klaus, and even Sunny felt in the time that followed. If you have ever lost someone very important to you, then you already know how it feels, and if you haven't, you cannot possibly imagine it. For the Baudelaire children, it was, of course, especially terrible because they had lost both of their parents at the same time, and for several days they felt so miserable they could scarcely get out of bed. Klaus found he had little interest in books. The gears in Violet's inventive brain seemed to stop, and even Sunny, who of course was too young to really understand what was going on, bit things with less enthusiasm. Of course, it didn't make things any easier that they had lost their home as well and all their possessions. As I'm sure you know, to be in one's own room, in one's own bed, can often make a bleak situation a little better, but the beds of the Baudelaire orphans had been reduced to charred rubble. Mr. Poe had taken them to the remains of the Baudelaire mansion, was and it was to see if anything had been unharmed, and it was terrible. Violet's microscope had fused together in the heat of the fire. Klaus's favorite pen had turned to ash, and all of Sunny's teething rings had melted. Here and there, the children could see traces of the enormous home they had loved, fragments of their grand piano, and elegant bottle of which Mr. Baudelaire kept brandy, the scorched cushion of the window seat where their mother liked to sit and read. Their home destroyed, the Baudelaires had to recuperate from their terrible loss in the Poe household, which was not at all agreeable. Mr. Poe was scarcely at home because he was very busy attending to the Baudelaire affairs, and when he was home, he was often coughing so much he could barely have a conversation. Mrs. Poe purchased clothing for the orphans that was in grotesque colors and itched, and the two Poe children, Edgar and Albert, were loud and obnoxious boys with whom the Baudelaires had to share a tiny room that smelled of some sort of a ghastly flower. But even given the surroundings, the children had mixed feelings when, over a dull dinner of boiled chicken and boiled potatoes and blanched. The word blanched here means boiled string beans. Mr. Poe announced that they were to leave his household the next morning. Good, said Albert, who had a piece of tomato stuck between his teeth. Now we can get our own room back. I'm tired of sharing it. Violet and Klaus are always moping around and they are never fun. And the baby bites, Edgar said, tossing a chicken bone to the floor as if he were an animal in a zoo and not the son of a well-respected member of the banking community. Where will we go? Violet asked nervously. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to say something, but erupted into a brief fit of coughing. I have made arrangements, he said finally, for you to be raised by a distant relative of yours who lives on the other side of town. His name is Count Olaf. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked at one another, unsure of what to think. On one hand, they didn't want to live with the Poes any longer. On the other hand, they had never heard of Count Olaf and didn't know what he would be like. Your parents will, Mr. Poe said, instructs that you will be raised in the most convenient way possible. Here in the city, you'll be used to your surroundings, and this Count Olaf is the only relative who lives within the urban limits. Klaus thought this over for a minute as he swallowed a chewy bit of bean. But our parents never mentioned Count Olaf to us. But just how is he related to us exactly? Mr. Poe sighed and looked down at Sunny, who was biting a fork and listening closely. He is either a second cousin, a third cousin 4 times removed, or a fourth cousin 3 times removed. He is not your closest relative on the family tree, but he's the closest geographically. That's why, if he lives in the city, Violet said, why didn't our parents ever invite him over? Possibly because he was very busy, Mr. Poe said. He's an actor by trade and often travels around the world with various theater companies. I thought he was a count, Klaus said. He is both a count and an actor, Mr. Poe said. Now I don't mean to cut short our dinner, but you children have to pack up your things, and I have to run to the bank to do some more work. Like your new legal guardian, I am very busy myself. The three Baudelaire children had many more questions for Mr. Poe, but he had already stood up from the table and with a slight wave of his hand departed from the room. They heard him coughing into his handkerchief, and then the front door creaked shut as he left the house. Well, Mrs. Poe said, you three had better start packing. Edgar, Albert, please help me clear the table. The Baudelaire orphans went to the bedroom and glumly packed their few belongings. And Klaus looked disastrous at each ugly shirt Mrs. Poe distastefully at each ugly shirt Mrs. Poe had bought for them as he folded them and put them into a small suitcase. Violet looked around the cramped, smelly room in which they had been living, and Sunny crawled around solemnly, biting each of Edgar and Albert's shoes, leaving small teeth marks in each one so she would not be forgotten. From time to time, the Baudelaire children looked at one another, but with their future such a mystery, they could think of nothing to say. At bedtime, they tossed and turned all night, scarcely getting any sleep between the loud snoring of Edgar and Albert and their own worried thoughts. Finally, Mr. Poe knocked on the door and stuck his head into the bedroom.